All right. Welcome to this lecture. Thank you for being here. I see some new faces, so maybe we'll give you an opportunity to introduce yourselves. I want to take a few minutes, maybe really just one, to introduce our guest speaker tonight. John Gennari comes to us from the University of Vermont. He is a professor of English and critical and race and ethnic studies, and he is an Americanist. He's trained in American studies, and he is invited because he is, I think, and I'm not the only one by any means to think that he's an important scholar in Italian American studies, especially in relation to sound studies and music, but also obviously ethnicity and race. His latest book, I want to showcase, just came out this past year. It's called Flavor and Soul, Italian America at its African American Edge. And he's going to be talking about Frank Sinatra. His talk today, his conversation, really, you're not off the hook. You're going to be part of the conversation here. It's called The House We Live In, Sinatra in the Age of Trump. I just wanted to mention also John's previous book, because he's also a jazz specialist. And his previous book is called Blowing Hot and Cool, Jazz and Its Critics, also from the University of Chicago Press, that publishes his latest book. And he's been awarded several prestigious prizes for his scholarship and for his book. So join me in welcoming John Gennari, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Clarissa. A great pleasure to be here for a number of reasons. It's been a rough winter in Vermont, and coming to a climate like this is lovely. This is my spring break week, and it started with actually not getting out of Burlington, Vermont on Saturday because of a canceled flight. Which seems to happen a lot during these months in my part of the country. So delighted to be here for that reason, but for another reason, which is that this book and the way that I think about Sinatra and the way I have experienced Italian American culture and its relationship to other ethnic cultures is very much of an East Coast experience and perspective. I grew up in a rural small town in the western part of Massachusetts, about 2 hours west of Boston, and about 3 hours north of New York City and New Jersey. New Jersey is a big theme in this book, and those of you who were able to read the chapter on Sinatra, I tell some stories about my mother's family in New Jersey and some connections actually we had to the Sinatra family, and so that's my mother's side of the family. My mother was second generation Italian American. Her parents came from the north of Italy, close to Verona, sort of between Verona and Vicenza in the Veneto. And my father grew up actually on a farm in a small town called Marola outside of Vicenza in that same region of Italy. He happened to be born in the United States because during the 1920s, his father was a socialist organizer during the time when the fascists under Mussolini were coming to power, and evidently he had enough trouble with the fascists that he thought it important to move the family out of Italy for a time. He had a brother who had come a few years earlier and was working in a granite quarry in western Massachusetts. There there are granite and marble quarries up and down the part of Massachusetts, the western part of Massachusetts where I come from, into Vermont, where I live now, and many of the Italian Americans who settled in that part of the country worked in those quarries. And so my father was, and his family went back when he was 5 years old. And so he grew up in Italy. Such schooling as he had came during that time. But then he came back by himself right after World War II in 1946, when he was 20 years old. And he could do so by virtue of having American citizenship, because of being, he was born on American soil. And after the armistice, after the war, the U.S. State Department actually communicated with a good number of Italian people that were living in Italy but who had U.S. citizenship, and really encouraged them to come to the States. And that's how he found his way back to Western Massachusetts, and he worked for many years. Even though he grew up on a farm, a dairy farm, he worked many years as a welder in a General Electric factory in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. My mother had, in New Jersey, had gone to school only to the 9th grade, and like many young women of her generation and her kind of family, left school because she needed to make some money to support the family. And like many young Italian women in that part of New Jersey and greater New York, her sewing skills were, she worked in textiles and in sewing shops just over the Hudson River from New York City, just north of Hoboken, where Sinatra comes from. And so I grew up in a working class family, people who worked with their hands. My mother doing needlework, my father as a welder, and a very proud gardener. The garden was the pride of the family and of the neighborhood. And as I tell the story in the autobiographical section of that Sinatra chapter, my sense of my own Italian-American identity came about in a funny way through Sinatra in this way. That in New Jersey, because Sinatra was from there and my relatives thought themselves really closely connected to him, I think I mentioned that my uncles, my mother's brother, my Uncle Abby, and his older brother, my Uncle Joe, they had a construction company, and they built one of Dolly Sinatra's, Frank Sinatra's mother, one of her retirement homes. She had several. One, out here, close to Sinatra's place in Palm Springs, and this was in northern New Jersey. But that's part of the story. Like Italian Americans, and not just Italian Americans from that part of New Jersey, which is a very populous, kind of area. It wasn't a small town like I grew up in. Yet everybody, either they did or they said they did, have a connection to the Sinatra family. There was that sense of a kind of village, connection. If you go to Hoboken these days, there's still that sense. I mean, people will tell you stories about their grandparents having lived next to the Sinatras. Like everybody in Hoboken must have lived right next to the Sinatras, right? But he was the local boy who made good. But for me, growing up, it was, I was born in 1960, and so I was a child of the rock and roll era. I wasn't interested in Frank Sinatra. That was the music that my parents and their friends would play, and we were into the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and soul music and funk music and such. And I played drums from an early age, and those were the kinds of music those are the genres of music that I performed right through college. But the sound of Sinatra was very much in the air, right? The tunes, And then also, as I mentioned in that chapter, Sinatra was on television a lot during these years, the 60s and 70s. Sinatra had a variety television show in the early 1950s, in the first generation of television, that lasted less than a year. And he was not good at it. It was a part of Sinatra's career when he was really struggling. His vocal cords had hemorrhaged. He was having trouble singing. In 1953, he got a great movie part in a film called From Here to Eternity that ended up with him winning an Academy Award, Supporting Actor Academy Award. But 50, 51, 52, this is sort of the down period for Sinatra. And when you read Sinatra biographies, they tend to be shaped as kind of traditional heroic narratives, right? A hero always has to have a period of, near death or real tragedy and has to make a comeback, right? I mean, that's sort of a, kind of stock formula for a heroic story. And the way the Sinatra story is told, that, after this period in the 30s and 40s when he makes it as a big band singer, and then in the 40s as a solo singer, is on top of the world. He decides to leave his wife, who had been his girlfriend back in New Jersey, because he was in love with another woman, and this caused all sorts of trouble, because that woman, while in deep love with Sinatra, was not interested in becoming the kind of wife that Sinatra wanted. He was very traditional in what he expected of a wife, and so very much in the news during this period, right? Italian couple, first Italian American couple of Hollywood, celebrity couple, and when they get a divorce, it's all over the newspapers. And as you know, I mean, Sinatra was a player, as they would say today. He had relationships with lots and lots of women. And it's interesting, if you do sort of that side of the history of Sinatra as a kind of Hollywood persona, that tension between his traditional ethnic family background and the fact that he was breaking all the rules, right? Transgressing all the rules of traditional Italian American morality, Catholic morality, is a source of endless commentary in the press, and endless commentary among Italian American families. So anyway, all of this is to say that the New Jersey side of Sinatra was sort of baked into my experience, because we would go to New Jersey all the time from Western Massachusetts. Why? Because we needed salami and cheese that we could not get anywhere between northern New Jersey and Lenox, Massachusetts. So we would make the 3-hour trip at least every other week, just to stock up on not just salami and cheese, and obviously you can get a lot of that and hold on to it, but to see our relatives and to stock up on food and family love. My father's brothers and sisters by that time had all emigrated to Western Massachusetts, and so they lived very close by. And this is what was interesting to me. So my father's family, including my father himself, they didn't like Sinatra. There was something about Sinatra's personality. There was something about the sound of his voice that it wasn't so much a dislike of him. They didn't like him as much as they liked particularly Dean Martin. And there were other singers who they liked as well. And in this chapter, I have a little riff about how Dean Martin, when you heard him on television, or when you heard him sing, he actually sounded like somebody who had grown up speaking Italian, right? You could hear that accent in his voice. And it was the same accent that I would hear in my aunts and uncles' voices on my father's side of the family. Didn't hear that on my mother's side of the family, right? Because my mother had grown up, they spoke some Italian dialect in the house, but they grew up as English speakers. But I should say New York, New Jersey English speakers, which is its own dialect of English. It has its own sound. And it's very familiar to us now, I think, because of the way that the media has capitalized on it. Anytime since the 1950s that Hollywood decides they want to do East Coast ethnicity, they tend to go to Brooklyn or New Jersey, or their characters who come from New Jersey who end up in other places. Like John Travolta. John Travolta, literally, the actor, comes from Englewood, New Jersey. You're going to do Saturday Night Fever very soon, right? Set in Brooklyn. But before Travolta starred in movies, his breakout thing was a television show called Welcome Back, Kotter, set in Brooklyn. And the sound of Travolta's voice in these films was so familiar to me. I mean, it was a New Jersey voice. New Yorkers would say that it's more of a New York voice that found its way to Jersey, but proud Jerseyans, like my mother's family, really wanted to claim that voice for themselves. And so for me, in other words, that sound, and it was Sinatra's sound when he wasn't singing. And this is the thing about Sinatra. When he sang, he went for a kind of elegant, elocutionary sound that didn't have any of the, he worked very hard to not just in that singing voice, but also in a kind of formal public voice, not to sound like somebody who had grown up in an Italian household. Not because he was ashamed of growing up Italian, but he thought there was something really important about. This was his particular formula, I guess is the way to put it. This was Sinatra's particular formula for being an Italian in America. It was to be both Italian and American, right? In terms of food, in terms of interest in the arts, in terms of concepts of loyalty and intimacy and such. But he thought it very important to Americanize the sound of his voice as a public persona. And so, as a singer, he was celebrated as somebody who was reviving an older tradition of what was called bel canto singing, Italian operatic singing, beautiful song, bel canto, right? And that was all about, sort of purity of tone and, a kind of beautiful line and purity of phrasing. And so this made him sound like a more formally trained European singer, right, in his performances, compared to somebody like Dean Martin, compared obviously to the jazz singers who he loves so much. I mean, he was influenced by all these folks, but he was going for a kind of he wanted that kind of high art European bel canto sensibility, right, to come through in the singing, and he wanted that kind of elegant elocutionary style when he was being interviewed by kind of elite newspapers, and when he gave talks at colleges, as he tended to do actually through the years. When he was talking with his homeboys, however, he was all New Jersey, right? It was dems and dozes and all of the slang of New Jersey. And the musicians who worked with him were endlessly fascinated by this, how he would, backstage, he would be slanging it up, with the fellow musicians. And Sinatra always traveled with an entourage of friends from, some who had been friends from all the way back in the day in New York and New Jersey. Not always Italian, but many of them Italian American. As you know, when he becomes part of the Rat Pack, the point about the Rat Pack is it's all of these ethnic others, Italians, Jews, African Americans, in the case of Sammy Davis Jr., Sammy is also Jewish, as it happens. So it's a kind of inclusive ethnicity, but it's the ethnicities that had been excluded from the dominant American WASP mainstream. And those tended to be the people who Sinatra hung with and felt comfortable with. And this has to do with, what I talk about in this chapter about his very close relationships with African American musicians from the jazz world, Jewish friends, and then Irish and kind of Anglo-WASP friends as well, who themselves were sort of rebels of one sort or another from their WASP backgrounds. The best example would be John Kennedy, right? He was sort of a fellow traveler with the Rat Pack in that period. And the Rat Pack was very instrumental in campaigning for Kennedy in 1960. And so this extraordinary thing, the very first Catholic president, Irish Catholic president, he has these ethnic others, the Rat Pack, as the kind of front operation for him. They sing benefits for him. They write songs for him. Sinatra is the person who organizes the Kennedy inauguration, and then there are stories about Frank getting down with. Is that the verb I want to use? Getting down with Jackie Kennedy the night of the inauguration. There are lots of these stories about Sinatra. But the point is, he had this really fascinating trickster kind of quality to him, because he had these. He was hanging with people who were thought to be, not. Who were suspect in one way or another. And this, of course, also has to do with the stereotype of Italian Americans being connected to the mafia and the mob. And Sinatra was, in the sense that anybody who worked in the entertainment industry at that time had connections to mob figures, because mob figures owned so many of the venues where the performances took place, and they provided so much of the front money for instance, the birth of Las Vegas and clubs, in New York and in L.A. and other cities where this kind of entertainment was on tap. So Sinatra was. Here's the thing about Sinatra. He was flaunting that sense of difference. He was flaunting that sense of transgression and danger and playing on the dark side and not being the kind of dutiful ethnic subject that had been expected of immigrants and their children, since the great wave of immigration in the late 19th century, early 20th century. If you get what I'm saying. So he was playing this really interesting game where the formula by which he became a powerful American figure, one of the most powerful people in the country. I mean, somebody with the power to, he owned, or he had, kind of major stock stake in record companies, racetracks, hotels, etc. He was also, somebody who, again, with Kennedy, but before that, during the early part of his career with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he was the person in the entertainment industry that politicians in the Democratic Party on the left went to for support, for an endorsement, and because they knew he had the kind of power that would really make a difference in the way people thought. So in that sense, he became the ultimate American insider, if you will, right? And he was one of the first people who was able to figure out how to sort of cultivate an ethnic identity that was, that was not, a kind of white bread identity, and still become mainstream, right? Still become the sort of person who, even though the FBI had, like a 1,300-page file on him, the FBI was tracking him all the time, thinking that he was connected to the mob, connected to communists, etc. And yet, this is the person who's in your living room because he's on television all the time. He makes Christmas records, when you're gathering around the Christmas tree at holiday time, you're listening to Frank Sinatra singing those songs, Dean Martin, the Rat Pack. We still do this in my household. I mean, well into February, my daughters are still so into the sound of these voices because to them it means holiday, it means good food, etc. So he becomes a force for American domestic warmth and family and harmony, even though his own personal life is a complete mess, right? And goes against all of those kind of virtues and kind of moralisms that historically America had expected of its immigrants. And for me, the sound of the voices was really central to this. So my New Jersey relatives were they were tough guys. They were tough guys, and they my uncle was somebody who was known for bar fights and such, and they weren't mob connected, but they had that aura about them because they look like today we would say they look like characters from The Sopranos. When The Godfather came out in the 1970s, my uncles, were part of that, consumer market that made sure that they all drove Cadillacs, and the horn on the Cadillac was the sound of the theme to The Godfather, right? So you pull up to a stop sign or a red light, and all of a sudden you're hearing the theme to The Godfather. There was a pride in that. In other words, there was a pride in that sense of that sense of presence. That sense of presence, like there was no question that you were American, right? And there was no question that you were making it. You were working hard. You were doing all the things that Americans were supposed to do to be good citizens, but you felt that there was something special about your people because of people like Frank Sinatra. You with me? African Americans have the same feeling traditionally about entertainers and sports figures and such. There's a way that popular culture is really, really central to elevating the sense of purpose and sense of presence of people who don't have other kinds of power. And this becomes a way that they get other kinds of power. Let me pause for just a second and take a breath and see if you have any questions or comments so far. Sir.
I taught a class at Baruch College years ago, and the students all, I asked them, it was a world history class, so I asked them to tell us their ethnicity. It was probably illegal, right? But anyway, I'd say half of them said, I'm 100% Italian. Mm-hmm. And they were very proud of that.
This is at Baruch.
Yeah, and there was an Indian student, and her name was Roma, but she called herself Roma, so she co-opted an Italian American identity, didn't want to talk about her own, house. Yeah. It was interesting.
Yeah. Now, what fascinates me, when was this? What year was this? 2003. In a second, or at some point, I'm going to read a section of my book where I'm talking about this whole question of ethnicity in America now, and who does embrace an ethnic identity, who does not. I find teaching at the University of Vermont, and I teach a course very similar to this, a course on Italian American culture, literature, etc. I get a lot of students who are Italian American, and when they sign up, if their father was Italian American, I see it in the last name. But then there are some anglicized names, and I come to find out that they're still Italian American, or they want to be Italian American. And what they tell me, and this is a question for all of you, is they tell me they want to take the class because in fact they didn't get enough in their childhood, other than sort of Sunday dinner and sort of the most basic kind of rituals of an Italian American kind of heritage association, but they wanted a deeper connection to it. And the reason is this, and every semester I get students who voice it in the same way. Who wants to be white? Right? I mean, what is white culture? What is whiteness? What do you associate with whiteness? And if you think about it, whiteness really is about power and privilege, but at the level of culture, what is it? Right? That's the thing about these white nationalists, and here we get to the Trump part of today's conversation. So proud of, being something, right? That's not Mexican, that's not black, that's not whatever. But where is the cultural content of what you're saying it is? And oftentimes you pose that question for these folks, and there are these, vague associations with Europe, and maybe the more intellectual of the folks will, talk about the Greco-Roman heritage. But coming down to our own time, what does whiteness really mean in terms of what you eat, what kind of music you listen to? And I think this is what my students are getting at. Like, one of the reasons for them that African American culture is something that they try to identify with and oftentimes become so fluent in is because it's an identifiable culture, right? How about for all of you? How strong or weak is your sense of ethnicity, whether it's Italian or some other ethnicity? Or another way to phrase the question is, how do you think about whiteness in relation to other kinds of identities? Sir.
So my grandfather was full-blooded Italian from Jersey. He didn't like Sinatra. He thought he was a Dodger in World War II.
There we go.
He didn't like him at all.
We're in Jersey.
I'm the worst grandson ever. I have no idea. But he was from Jersey. He actually wanted to be seen as white, so he actually got away from Jersey, came to San Diego, and tried to raise his family in the Anglo-Saxon kind of way.
Interesting.
And so my father did the same thing, and I, even though I am a quarter-blooded Italian, do not consider myself Italian because I don't carry any actual Italian traditions in my family that I know of. Because my grandfather just kind of threw it off to the side when he married a white girl from Iowa. So it's kind of interesting. The lack of culture, and one of the reasons I came to this course is I wanted to kind of look at what kind of things he did do and what kind of experiences he had. And but as for me identifying as an Italian, I feel that you have to, I guess, practice customs to truly consider yourself to be a legitimate Italian versus someone who's just by blood Italian. But that's just one opinion.
But you're trying. You come to a course like this, and yeah. How about others?
I am half Italian, half Irish. My father is full Italian, my mom was full Irish. But as growing up, we always associate ourselves as Italian. And there was this real big, we gave my mom St. Patrick's Day to show the Irishness.
Yeah.
But going to family functions, my grandparents always spoke in English.
Yeah.
But when they were together with their brothers and sisters, it was always in Italian. Because they felt both my grandparents came from Italy. They came over on the boat, very young age. But they felt that if you're in America, you need to do the American customs. And that was their very, they were very gung-ho about that.
Yeah.
And even when we tried to speak Italian, they said, no, you're here as an American.
Yeah.
And their background is farming, cultivating, the market, all of those.
Yeah.
But they were very strong about that.
Yeah.
And so when I filled out those applications, it was always white because there was no spot for Italian, Irish.
Yeah.
So that's how I associate myself as a white
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
Do you mind rephrasing the question? Because I really want to answer.
But you answer the question you wanna answer.
Well, I'm 3/4 Italian and I'm 1/4 Portuguese, and I don't consider myself Portuguese at all. Like when people ask, I'm like, oh, I'm Italian. My name is Gianna Diana Carvello, so it's full blown, like right there.
Yeah.
My dad's half and half, my mom's full, and I have like on both sides Italian immigrant grandparents. So I don't know. I feel like it's very like prominent within me. Like I have different experiences with both these people, where like I have all those traditions and I have We always get together, we play the Italian music, we make the Italian food, we have like, we do those traditions like during the holiday season, whether it's Easter or Christmas or even like birthdays. So, I mean, I do consider myself like white, but I also do consider myself being more ethnic than like probably most white people, just because like I feel like I have so many different like customs and traditions.
Yeah.
Even if I like don't fully speak it, I mean it's like it's there.
Yours is such an interesting case, you know, because I think what's happened in our country, if we think about ethnicity, you know, sort of across of ethnicities, there are certain ethnicities that trump other ethnicities. So we have a very strong sense of what Italian American is because of media attention to Italian Americans. Portuguese Americans? I mean, can we cite any mass media products that, you know, would focus on, you know, Portuguese American culture? I mean, you know, I think that there, you know, there's a wonderful cuisine. There's a really interesting history.
It's like the sweetbread and linguiça, like the only part of like my Portuguese culture that I really connect with is probably like those two things, and also the like big parade that they have every like May in Point Loma, because like, there's such a prominent Portuguese community there.
Yeah.
But that's all I really see, and that's all I really connect with.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I have a friend from graduate school who's Polish American, and we would talk about food a lot. That was and we would cook for each other a lot. And she continues to ask the question, how come pierogies have not made it into American culture in the same way as, you know, various Italian food? We were in graduate school at the time that the bagel, you all know what a bagel is. 30 years ago, a lot of Americans did not know what a bagel was. Or the word was a new word in common, you know, it was not new in places that had, you know, large populations of Jewish folk, and you didn't have to be Jewish to know what a bagel was. My first year teaching at a graduate school in the early 1990s was in a small town in Indiana, and the bagel had just arrived the year before. And the hospital, the local hospital, had a big problem with people cutting themselves, not knowing how to cut a bagel. They didn't yet get that, you know, that bagel cutter kind of thing you can now find in any bagel shop. You know, you stick the bagel in there and just, you know, like your, what's the term I want for a beheading? A guillotine. It's like a bagel guillotine, right? Which is the safest way to cut a bagel. And there were just a lot of people who were like cutting the bagel this way and then cutting themselves, ending up in the emergency room. But the pierogi would be perfect for, you know, it freezes well, it, you know, it's tasty, etc. But there's a way in which Polish American, the numbers of Polish Americans, I can't tell you what the figures are off the top of my head, but particularly in places like Chicago, huge numbers of Polish Americans. Their particular cuisine and ethnic culture more generally has just not gotten as much play as Italian American culture and others. Why that is historically, I'm not sure. These days, Italian American is sexier than Irish American, right? And it's become interesting if you're a film person. In recent years, I'm going to allude to this in something I may read, time permitting, from the book. When Martin Scorsese, the great Italian American filmmaker, Goodfellas, et cetera, when he started making films about Irish gangsters, right? A lot of Italian Americans were, what are you doing? Like, this isn't your thing. And Scorsese was like, well, Italian gangsters isn't my thing either. I mean, I'm interested in gangsters, right? But you know what I'm saying? I mean, there's a way in which there's a foregrounding of certain kinds of ethnic experience, and oftentimes it's pushed by the media. My Big Fat Greek Wedding was this movie that came out, I don't know what year it was, but all of a sudden Greek American became a recognizable identity in a way that it wasn't before. And I think the thing about Sinatra was the person who put Italian American identity into the American equation in the middle decades of the 20th century. His music, his films, etc. And as much as anything, that's why he's important. But what I'm trying to argue in this chapter that you've read is that it's also important that he crossed the boundary to connect with black folks and other ethnicities, and he was fascinated by diversity, and he embraced it, even while he wanted to, project a sense of Italianness. He said, I tell the story, one of the band leaders, or the manager for the band leaders, wanted to do what Sinatra, what was often done with Italian and Jewish performers at that time, which was to anglicize their names. And they said, you're going to be Frankie Satin. And he said, no, the name is Frank fucking Sinatra, right? And he held on to Sinatra, and that was even, again, as I was saying before, he didn't want to sound Italian, right, in the way somebody who had spoken Italian growing up did, but he wanted to signal his pride in Italianness through his name and in other ways.
Yeah, so my story is similar to Donna's. My grandparents, my grandpa on my mom's side grew up in Jersey, in Hoboken in the Bronx, and kind of lived that life. And didn't go through high school, left I think after his freshman year, but he was into the sports. He was always on the street, and then my mom was born in the hospital that Frank Sinatra was born in, and she,
See what I'm talking about? It's a small village. Yes.
And so then my mom's parents moved out to Northern California when she was about 3 and started a sausage manufacturing plant and opened up pizzerias and restaurants. And so the food part of the Italian culture it runs deep in my veins, and I've always said that I have pasta sauce instead of blood in my body because that's kind of how I grew up. I mean, I was rolling out meatballs and making homemade pasta before I knew what it even was. And so it's, for me, to most everybody here, I'm white, but then people ask me, oh, are you Greek? I go, no, I'm Italian. They say, oh, well, I totally see it in your eyes and nose now. Like, well, I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean. So, yeah, it's, at first glance, we kind of all have, a lot of Europeans have that same identification as white, but I think to a lot of us, there's a lot more beneath the surface than just what you see.
Well, one of the things that's beneath the surface, and I love these. Thank you for sharing these stories about your backgrounds. The reason my book is about Italian America at its African American edge is one of the reasons is this: that my training as an academic in the early part of my career in graduate school, and then the first book that I wrote, was in African American history and culture, connected with jazz and other kinds of music in particular. And it was my African American friends and colleagues in this field African American studies who certainly encouraged my research and my writing on jazz and soul and such. But they also said to me, you've got to deal with this Italian thing. And in particular, you've got to deal with this question of Italians and race. And they were saying Italians and racism in some cases, right? Because they might have come from the kind of places where Italians and blacks were, really rivals, and there was violence connected with that relationship. But they were telling me also, in the broadest sense, what race are Italians, right? Where do they position themselves in relation to whiteness? And this happened to be becoming at that time a really interesting academic question, or something that scholars were really thinking a lot about. And a bunch of us contributed to a book that came out in 2003 called Are Italians White? How Race is Made in America. And this continues to be an interesting, kind of field of scholarship, because when you look at the history of Italy itself, there's a very important kind of history of race making in Italy. In the broadest sense, it's the way that the north of Italy thinks of itself as being a different kind of people, a different kind of culture than the south of Italy, and it's totally a racialized kind of discourse. and it travels to this country, right? Most Italians in the 100-year ago great wave of emigration from Italy to this country. Most Italians were from the south, from Sicily and Calabria, and the poorer part of Italy, right? I mean, that obviously is a recipe for emigration. And the sense of even being part of an Italian nation or an Italian identity for somebody from Sicily, you didn't have that when you were in Italy, right? You didn't really consider yourself an Italian until you came to America, right? When all people who came from any part of the peninsula or the islands, all of a sudden you're all Italians. Well, the history of Italy is a history of regionalism and localism, and a nation that really can't, to this day, really keep it together necessarily, or that continues to have a great deal of kind of regional kind of identity, and what did this mean? It meant that Southern Italians who came to this country had already been racialized by Northern Italians, right? You're below us. You're closer to Africa than to Northern Europe. And so there's that sense of kind of Northern Europe as being a more civilized kind of culture. And so what happens for such folks in the American context is really interesting. What do? Do you then identify yourself with African Americans and other people of what academics call a subaltern identity, an ethnic other identity? Do you have solidarity with those people who are also not thought of as white? Or do you try to become white, right? Because what you see is that the American formula for power and privilege is whiteness. The Irish figured that out, right? Ireland had been, within the British Empire, it had been, the kind of racial other to the Anglo elite. And many of the same kind of stereotypes that are visited upon African Americans in this country, lazy, they sing well and dance well, but they can't keep a job, etc. These are quite familiar stereotypes to Irish folk because the English were putting those stereotypes on Irish folk for centuries. So the Irish come to this country, and they've got a decision to make. Like, are they gonna identify with the blacks who are similarly racialized? Well, they did on the minstrel stage and other places in the entertainment world. But in the world of power and privilege, they figure out pretty quickly becoming a police officer, becoming a politician, or something like that. That's how you're going to really make it in this country. In the Irish, particularly in the East Coast cities, they come to dominate police departments. They dominate the Catholic Church. Italians always in this country feel a sense of, kind of otherness within the Catholic Church structure, which to this day is dominated at the highest reaches by the Irish. Even as the people who are actually going to Catholic churches now are actually mostly Latino and Black and even Asian, right? Irish and Italian and even Polish Catholics who go to church, that's a downward trend line, right? And it's people of color who are keeping most Catholic parishes alive. Interesting kind of story. So the question becomes, how does that decision about how to connect yourself or not connect yourself to whiteness, how does that get made? And Sinatra is so interesting, I think, as a kind of ambivalent figure in this respect. There's a black Sinatra, and what I mean by that is very proud of his connections to the jazz world, very proud of his friendships with African American colleagues and friends. But then there's also a white Sinatra. There's a way in which Sinatra becomes a symbol of a sort of kind of whiteness, or of an ethnic figure who becomes a white figure. And I'm going to show you examples of this in just a second. And so, to me, Sinatra's story has both of those kinds of elements. And I think it has, the title I gave for this talk, Sinatra in the Age of Trump, the house we live in. I don't have much to say about Trump. I don't know. I assume that Sinatra would not like Trump. I don't know. But what I do know is that there was something about Sinatra's story that plays into issues that are right front and center today, having to do with immigration, citizenship, who's a real American. And so I'm going to show you a couple things that bear on this. Do you want to take a break at some point, or should we push on?
Well, let's ask you guys, do you prefer to take a break now? Shall we go into this part of the conversation?
Keep going for a while? Yeah. Okay, so 1945, Frank Sinatra appears in a short film called The House I Live In. Has anybody seen this before? What was the context you saw it?
A few days ago, because a professor posted it.
Oh, so you were supposed to look at it for today. So you've seen it.
But, I assigned it, but I think it's always a good idea to go over it.
Okay. So then I have to wonder why we only have one hand up.
No, I saw it.
Okay. So you know what I'm talking about here. But let's look at a little of this, and then I'm going to show you something else connected with it. So remember, he's in a recording studio. I always get a kick out of this guy with the pipe and the lab coat.
Just 5 minutes and I'll have the other number ready. I get a smoke. Next number, boys. Somebody in for liquor?
You bet, I got smear.
Yeah, but 10 against 1. That's not very fair.
Ah, come on, hurry.
What's it all about?
None of your business.
Scared to tell me?
No, I'm not as scared. I'll fight you even.
And if I can help it, I just want to know why the gang won.
We don't like him. We don't want him in our neighborhood or going to our school. I've been living here as long as you.
What's he got, smallpox or something?
We don't like his religion.
His religion?
Look, mister, he's a dirt.
Now, hold on. I see what you mean. You must be a bunch of those Nazi werewolves I've been reading about.
Mister, are you screwy?
Not me, I'm an American.
Well, what do you think we are?
Nazis?
Don't call me a Nazi. My father was sergeant in the army. He been wounded even.
Wounded, huh? Say, I bet he got some of that blood plasma.
He was wounded so bad he had to get it 3 times.
Son, anybody in your family ever go to the blood bank?
Sure, my mother and my father both.
Uh-huh. You know what? I bet you maybe his pop's blood helped save your dad's life. That's bad.
What's bad about it?
Well, don't you see? Your father doesn't go to the same church as his father does. That's awful. Do you think maybe if your father knew about it in time, he would rather have died than to take blood from a man of another religion? Would you have wanted him to die? Would your mom want him to die?
No.
Look, fellas, religion makes no difference, except maybe to a Nazi or somebody as stupid. Why, people all over the world worship God in many different ways. God created everybody. He didn't create one people better than another. Your blood's the same as mine, mine's the same as his. Do you know what this wonderful country is made of? It's made up of 100 different kind of people, and 100 different ways of talking, and 100 different ways of going to church. But they're all American ways. Wouldn't we be silly if we went around hating people because they comb their hair different than ours? Wouldn't we be a lot of dopes? My dad came from Italy, but I'm an American. But should I hate your father because he came from Ireland or France or Russia? Wouldn't I be a first-class fathead? You guys remember Pearl Harbor? Why, the Japs socked us so it looked like we could never do anything about it. But a couple of days later, something very important happened. Close your eyes, let me tell you about it. Go on, close your eyes, all of you. I want you to imagine. There was a Jap battleship, the Haruna, and one of our planes spotted it. You know what it takes to bomb a battleship? It takes guts, and know-how, and teamwork. And our boys sure needed plenty of it, because that Jap was throwing up enough flak to get out and walk home on. But the pilot had only one thing on his mind, to get over that ship. And he did. And then the bombardier pushed a button and a 500-pound tornado smacked that Jap right in the middle. Yep, they sank it. And every American threw his head back and felt much better. The pilot of that ship was named Colin Kelly, an American and a Presbyterian. And you know who dropped the bombs? Meyer Lovett, an American and a Jew. You think maybe they should have called the bombing off because they had different religions? Think about that, fellas. Use your good American heads. Don't let anybody make suckers out of you. Well, gotta go to work.
What do you work?
I sing.
Ah, you're a kid.
Come here. They all stand here, and no hissing allowed. What is America to me? A name, a map, or a flag I see. A certain word, democracy. What is America to me? A house I live in, a plot of earth, a street, a grocer and a butcher, and the people that I meet, the children in the playground, the faces that I see, all races and religions, that's America to me. The place I work in, the worker at my side, the little town or city where my people lived and died, the howdy and the handshake, the air of feeling free, and the right to speak my mind out, that's America to me. The things I see about me, the big things and the small, the little corner newsstand and the house a mile tall, the wedding and the churchyard, the laughter and the tears, the dream that's been a-growing for 150 years. The town
Unbelievably corny, right? But let's remember, this is wartime, and there's a lot of anxiety in this country about loyalty to the country, and can we count on the loyalty of people like Japanese Americans, Italian Americans, African Americans? I mean, African Americans. There were in the jazz world in particular. There were folks who really resisted serving in the army because it was a segregated army. You're going to ask us to go fight against racism in Europe when the army itself is a completely racially segregated institution? I'm not having it. There's a lot of resistance on the part of certain, kind of progressive elements within the African community. There are also a great number of African Americans who serve proudly and honorably in the armed services during that time, as has been true of any time when the nation has readied itself for war. But African Americans are cut out after the war of the GI benefits that accrue to service members. You could not get the support of Southern politicians to have the government give the same level of benefits, GI educational benefits, mortgage benefits, et cetera, to buy a house. They're not going to support that if the money is going to go to non-white people. So this is an issue within the black community. You know the story of Japanese American internment. There were Italian Americans, far fewer numbers than the Japanese, who were interned, who were put into camps out of this sense that we can't be certain of their loyalty to this country when we're fighting against them in war. People like my grandparents, my mother's parents, who were living in this country as aliens, they were not citizens, right? When war is declared against Italy, they have to go and get certified as resident aliens. I have the paperwork from my grandparents going and being, declared resident aliens. Never heard any stories about this growing up. It was a source of great shame among Italian Americans who had been in this country, who had children who were serving in the armed forces, and yet, they were being spotlighted as not fully a part of the national community. Sinatra himself, what's your name?
Edward.
Sinatra himself, as Edward knows from his Jersey, family, he's a very complicated figure in relation to World War II because he does not serve in the army. And a bunch of Italian Americans who did resent him, not just because he's not serving, but because he's home singing to women who they have left behind. And he's singing, in a way that is generating feelings of romance and more than romance. And he becomes a figure of desire that men who are off fighting the war resent. And so he's here representing the government, right? But one of the reasons he's keen to do this is because there's a sense in the broader community that he's not doing enough for the nation, right? I just want to show you, the song itself continues to be corny. I don't care who sings it. But what's interesting, I was just bopping around on YouTube to see who else has done interesting versions of it. Interesting not because it's a good song anytime, but for the context in which they sing it. On your own, you are going to do the House I Live in. Patti LaBelle. You know who Patti LaBelle is? The African American singer, soul singer, R&B singer. At Sinatra's 80th birthday party, big Hollywood to-do, she sings an amazing version of this terrible song. But she's got the most soaring voice. And it's Sinatra, just a few years before he dies. The birthday's in 1995. He dies in 1998. And it's so moving to see his reaction to this performance of the song. And you can see he's remembering his own performance of it from many years before. But he's so fascinated by Patti LaBelle's rendition of it as a singer, as a fellow singer. And it gets at the way that Sinatra was so connected to people within the world of entertainment, and was such a champion of African Americans in particular, who might have needed a break at a time when they might not be getting the same kind of bookings as white entertainers.
We can play it if you want. You guys want to see it? We can just play it on the.
You can do it off of the.
Now I'm curious.
Now you're curious, yeah.
Let's just.
So you'll do it off of your main thing, yeah.
Something went wrong. That's not good. That may not just be you doing something. taking over. I know I couldn't resist. I
Oh, that's
cannot
okay.
resist taking over, especially from a man. So.
Good for you. There it is.
The first one?
Yep, the first one.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Robert Wagner.
In 1945,
Frank, that's America to me. The things I see about me, all the big things and the small. Little corner you stand on the house of my soul. The way that touch of
She's bringing that old time gospel thing into it, right?
the town I live in. The streets, the house, the road, the pavement of the city, Oregon Avenue, the church, the school, the clubhouse, the million lights I see, especially the people. That's America. Oh, especially the people. And that's America. Oh, that's America.
Follow that, Frankie.
What's that?
Follow that, Frankie.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, what I want to do, I wonder though if we should take a short break first.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
Let's take yeah. But you can also make it more informal, you know, like you can approach John and talk to him.
Yeah.
Let's take 5.
So I want to read you from a section of the book that you have not been assigned, at least yet.
But you will.
And what it's going to do, it's going to use Sinatra to sort of, frame a discussion of issues of race and ethnicity in politics. And you'll see Sinatra's, kind of moving in and out of this, and he's not. I'm not talking about him as a singer. I'm talking about him as a symbol, if you will, a kind of mediating symbol. And and in the middle of this, you also get a couple of paragraphs where I'm giving you, I think, the best summation of the argument that I have in the book. So bear with me. Some of this is maybe just a little dense, but I think we can get through it, and hopefully it'll be helpful to you. So I'm on page 213, second paragraph. I say, we began our journey, in other words, the beginning of this book, at the historical moment when Frank Sinatra emerged as an important national figure. It is perhaps not coincidental that this was the same time, the World War II years, when the concept of ethnicity first took firm hold in American social science and popular discourse. It first took firm hold in American social science and popular discourse as a tool for understanding American social heterogeneity, American diversity. It's really fascinating when you actually research the term ethnicity, that it is really not in play until the 1940s. And it's World War II that does it. And here's why. Anglo-centric, in other words, English-centric nativism of the pre-1924 period had cast immigrant Italians as a distinctive and inferior race unworthy of American citizenship. So Italians were considered a race of their own. And sometimes actually there was a distinction drawn between Southern Italians and Northern Italians. And for the reasons I discussed earlier, the idea was to denigrate or derogate the Southern Italians and to suggest that they're not, from the Anglo-centric point of view, they're not as worthy of American citizenship as Northern Italians or English people or Germans. By contrast, the late 1930s Popular Front and the 1940s wartime ideology of pluralist Americanism gave second-generation U.S.-born Italian Americans a strong sense of inclusion in the national community. So that's people of Sinatra's generation, my mother's generation. Now all of a sudden in the 30s and 40s, there's talk of American diversity, including a wider range of people. Now this, of course, does not include the several hundred Italian Americans who were interned and the thousands who were declared illegal aliens. The ethnic distinctiveness of different Americans of European descent became an emblem of national pride, fodder for an ideology of democratic inclusiveness that became a key ingredient of American exceptionalism. But because this new concept of ethnicity was inherently racialized, Eurocentric formulation was an inherently racialized Eurocentric formulation of American pluralism. This model of inclusiveness actually operated as a vehicle of exclusion. The national community Sinatra invoked in the propaganda film The House I Live In, for example, and I'm sure you noticed this, includes the Irish, Italians, and Jews, makes no mention at all of African Americans, and pointedly excludes the Japs, right? So in other words, there's a new concept in place of who's a part of the we of America, right? Now it's going to include all the European groups, right? But there's still going to be a kind of wall put up, the circle of the we, to Asians, particularly Japanese, the Japanese, and African Americans, in spite of their prominence in American popular culture, they're just not part of this narrative, right? And that's very interesting. In other words, no sooner did Italian Americans become ethnics, that's a term that now you began to see in popular discourse, an ethnic, then they became white ethnics, even though that term did not become commonplace for another couple of decades. A familiar narrative tells us that over time, with post-war suburbanization and class mobility, Italians, became less and less ethnic and more white. A related narrative tells us that when Italian Americans self-consciously endeavored to revive and intensify their ethnic consciousness, they did so as part of an effort to resist the advances of African Americans and to create a zone of safety inside a nation they saw as falling hostage to the surging power of non-white racial minorities. So Italians, in other words, who had been a racial minority, right, now in the moment in the late 60s, early 70s of what was called the ethnic revival movement, now there's a sense of the we that's being defined against other racial minorities, in particular African Americans and Latinos. This was the period of the ethnic revival movement of the 60s and 70s, when the terms white ethnic and white ethnicity came into vogue. This movement had far more to do with politics than culture. Ethnicity, not of the My Big Fat Greek Wedding and Tony and Tina's Wedding variety, but as an alignment among working class and lower middle class whites based on shared affective and socioeconomic interests, in particular an antagonism towards state-sponsored measures on behalf of people of color, affirmative action, and other efforts to rectify histories of exclusion. This was a grievance-based politics, a politics of resentment that found its popular symbols in flag-waving, anti-liberal hard hats, construction worker hard hats. In places like New York, you would see photographed in the newspapers and on television and the evening news, and stridently outspoken mothers waging resistance to school busing programs. School busing in places like Boston were moving children out of their neighborhoods to try to create integrated school systems. The people who organized against that tended to be white in Boston, Irish and Italian mothers who took to the streets in a spirit of protest that was very self-consciously modeled on or fashioned after the civil rights protests of the previous decade. But now they're going against integration of the schools. Michael Novak, the leading intellectual spokesperson for what he called the unmeltable ethnics, hatched the sardonic acronym PIGS, Poles, Italians, Greeks, and Slavs, to name the ethnic groups at the center of this affective alliance. He excluded Jews from his Southern and Eastern European immigrant ethnic formation, reckoning that they had become, not least in their sympathy for blacks, part of the elite liberal establishment. So Jews had, they had made it, and they're now part of the establishment. These others are, still struggling, but their sense of who they're struggling against is people of color. Even as Sinatra broke his ties with the Democratic Party during this period, and you read in the first chapter what I say about how after Kennedy gets elected, and then after Kennedy gets assassinated, John Kennedy gets assassinated, Sinatra feels this real sense of resentment toward the Kennedys and the Democratic Party because they seem to be moving away from him. And he felt some, kind of personal slights, and he eventually becomes a Republican by the end of the decade. And he's connected with Nixon, later connected with Reagan. So this figure, Frank Sinatra, who back in the 1930s had been a very strong four-square liberal and considered part of the Hollywood liberal establishment, by the 1970s and into the 1980s, he's aligned more with conservatism. So, even as Sinatra broke his ties with the Democratic Party, he did not embody the ascendant tenor of this moment, late 60s, nearly as well as someone like Anthony Imperiali, who in Newark, New Jersey was a civic leader who wielded a baseball bat to defend his neighborhood during the city's racial unrest in the summer of 1967, and who advocated still more robust forms of armed white self-defense against the likes of Amiri Baraka. I mentioned Baraka in the introduction to the book, very important black poet who becomes part of the resistance movement in Newark, New Jersey. And it's black people who are fighting against an Italian political establishment. The town is run by Italians, the police department is run by Italians, and blacks want power. They want a piece of the action. When Sinatra reemerged on the national scene in the 1980s, it was not just as the regal dawn of American popular song, but also as Ronald Reagan's ally in a mission to bury the fractious politics of the 1960s and 70s under a refurbished American patriotic nationalism. Thus did Sinatra's singing of The House I Live In at the centennial celebration of the Statue of Liberty in 1986 become a landmark event in the crystallization of a European American-centric nation of immigrants narrative of U.S. national identity. I'm not going to play it for you, but because he doesn't sing it nearly as well as Patti LaBelle. But he sings it again in 1986 with the Statue of Liberty as the backdrop. Flying in, I read this fascinating essay. Let's see. It's actually a speech. A scholar named, I don't remember his name. Yes, Tyler Stovall. He's a historian, actually, at UC Santa Cruz, and he was the president of the American Historical Association this past year. And he gave his presidential address on the history of the Statue of Liberty. It's a fascinating piece. If you're interested, go online and just Google American Historical Association 2017 presidential address. And taught me a lot that I didn't know about the Statue of Liberty, right, in New York Harbor. I mean, I used to live in Jersey City on the New Jersey side, looking out right at the Statue of Liberty. And it's the symbol of, what do we think of it as? We think of it as a symbol of a nation of immigrants, right? We're welcoming everybody to our shores. Stovall tells this very interesting story about how, in fact, a couple of things. One, in the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, when the French are offering this, or talking about offering this as a gift to this country to celebrate, the centennial of the American War of Independence, and thereby to kind of suggest this solidarity between America and France as the great democracies and the great beacons of freedom in the world. The French actually wanted to somehow do something that would represent, among other things that it was supposed to symbolize, the abolition movement, the abolition of slavery, right? And there was such resistance to this on the part of the Americans because, like what I'm saying about the house I live in, it excludes African Americans from the story that's being told about what America actually is, right? So we don't want to really spotlight the history of slavery and the place of African Americans in this kind of sense of a national community and a national story. And the piece goes on to talk about the way that it wasn't until the 1930s and 1940s, the same time that Sinatra steps forth as a symbol of this new concept of American pluralism. That is the moment when the Statue of Liberty becomes a symbol of the welcoming of immigrants. Up to that time, it had actually been seized on the part of the people who were opposed to immigration. In this sense, that there was this idea that this lady who was standing, Lady Liberty, was a white woman on a pedestal. And this is the period leading up until 1924, when we close our doors to immigrants from everywhere, right? And the sense of what those immigrants are bringing to this country, Italians, Jews, etc., is a kind of assault on America's racial purity. And the white woman is the ultimate symbol of America's white racial purity. And so the Statue of Liberty becomes something that's iconic within the anti-immigrant movement. Also iconic in something like this, which is a which is a cartoon that actually comments on a lynching of 3 black men in the Missouri Ozarks. The black men are accused of sexually assaulting a white woman, and before there's a, this is what a lynching was. Before there was actually a trial, a lynch mob is gotten up, and the alleged perpetrators are hung to die in some sort of public way. What the cartoon, which appeared in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch under the title "Oh Liberty, What Crimes Are Committed in Thy Name," is actually showing Lady Liberty holding up the 3 lynched black males, right? So reinforcing the sense that Lady Liberty is really about white womanhood and the protection of white racial superiority and white racial purity. Very interesting piece. Can't recommend it highly enough for getting at issues of race and gender, right? Because the idea of the white woman on a pedestal, right, is so central to the American, kind of racial equation that, what's feared at the end of slavery, with the end of, or the beginning of Reconstruction, why Reconstruction fails, so much of a kind of anxiety that black men are going to defile white women, right? And 19th century concepts of womanhood are so connected with this idea of the domestic female figure, right? Celebrated as a symbol of the nation. So powerful and triumphant, but also vulnerable to the racial and ethnic other. So in this sense, when I see, I'm not going to show it to you, but when I see Sinatra in 1986 singing "The House I Live In" with the Statue of Liberty in the background, right? Now I'm thinking, wow, Sinatra has fully become a symbol of this kind of thinking about what America stands for. Not that earlier idea of, pluralism, World War II era pluralism, that, we're all the same no matter what religion, race, etc. I think unwittingly, because I don't think Sinatra was, necessarily aware of this history of what the statue stood for. But in the light of something like this, you can understand why, from the contemporary point of view, we might think of, Sinatra as unwittingly now becoming a symbol of a kind of whiteness that has very little to do with his earlier, transgressive Italianness. Yeah, I think I'm going to leave it there in terms of reading from this section of the book. But I do want to say that, again, what makes Sinatra so fascinating to me is this tension between the ways in which he can be used to symbolize whiteness and the ways throughout his career when he demonstrated a kind of fluidity and comfort level with crossing the race line that was very unusual for the time. So here's an example of Sinatra singing with the great jazz singer Ella Fitzgerald.
I've wined and dined at Mulligan's too, and never whispered turkey as I hitched the kite to the plane to Albuquerque. Alas, I missed the Botox ball, and what is twice as sad? I've never been to a party.
So I have other things, kind of queued up that would give you, more of a sense of, Sinatra's connection to black musicians. And then I'll end on this. This book for me started in the 1990s when there were lots of things going on in my life and in the media that really foregrounded this Black Italian connection. Some examples of that would be the Spike Lee movies. I think you're gonna see Do the Right Thing in this course a few weeks from now. Do the Right Thing, Jungle Fever, early Spike Lee movies that are set in New York City, and they're all about the tensions, both the tensions and kind of interesting cultural intersections between blacks and Italians. Sinatra comes to the forefront for me in 1995 when Vibe magazine, which is sort of a slick hip hop magazine, runs a story a story by a writer named Bones Malone, who I had been reading in Vibe and some other places for a couple of years. He was a black writer from Brooklyn. He had this really fresh, kind of black vernacular writing style, and he's writing about gangster rap. He's writing about East Coast, West Coast, kind of stylistic differences in hip hop. If like me, you're kind of middle-aged guy who's not listening to much of this music anymore, but wants to know what's going on, this is the kind of thing you would read to make believe that you knew what was going on. And so here, Bones Malone publishes this piece in Vibe that's a tribute to Frank Sinatra, calling Frank Sinatra the OG, the original gangsta. And let me just quote from this in this section that you do have in your assigned reading. Page 39. Who is the original gangsta? Was this question in 1990s rap aficionado circles, and it's settled once and for all when Bones Malone, known to Vibe readers as a redoubtable arbiter of street authenticity, tells us it's not one of the usual suspects. It's not Ice-T, Ice Cube, Tupac, Schoolie D, Suge Knight, not even Snoop Dogg. No, the dopest, fattest, most uncompromising voice of hip-hop authenticity turns out to be Frank Sinatra. Way before gangster rap, I'm quoting now, there was already a king on the hill, a G with the kind of class that makes a person untouchable. No matter where he showed up throughout the country, Sinatra would do anything to blow up the spot, always looking for a lamppost so his big band could G off. In Malone's hagiography, Sinatra's music is inseparable from his image, both setting the standard for stylish virility. Quoting Malone, his tough Jersey accent redefined the American language. Plus he used his voice, not a gun, and made the girlies stick out them tits like it was a holdup. Mind you, this was in the 1940s when girls wasn't giving up the coochie. This is what got me started writing this book. I mean, honestly. I mean, if there's a black guy who's going to come out for Sinatra this way, then I gotta take the ball and run with it. So keen was Malone's infatuation, so awed was he by Sinatra's facade of mastery, that he was overcome by racial envy. I've always wanted to be Italian, he said ruefully, but I'll have to settle for being black and cool. Malone was being playfully hyperbolic, but his sentiment resonates with a distinct tradition of interethnic identification. One finds the black Italian crossover fantasy, for instance, lurking in the imagination of no less an icon of black male cool than Marvin Gaye. My dream was to become Frank Sinatra, Gaye said. I loved his phrasing. He grew into a fabulous jazz singer, and I used to fantasize about having a lifestyle like his, carrying on in Hollywood and becoming a movie star. Every woman in America wanted to go to bed with Frank Sinatra. He was the king I longed to be. My greatest dream was to satisfy as many women as Sinatra. Such fantasies of Sinatra as the ultimate player, or playa in hip-hop slang, go back to the iconic swinging bachelor period of the late 1950s. Writing in the jazz magazine Metronome in 1957, Bill Koss, he's a jazz writer, hailed Sinatra as the most fantastic symbol of American maleness yet discovered. A man who looks at women as if he didn't care what they thought and lives as if the world and its women were pretty much built for him. Looking back, alas, there's something curiously strained about this image of Sinatra as the paragon of no strings attached, uber male sovereignty and freedom. Koss's breathless hype came just a few years after Sinatra suffered near suicidal despair at losing Ava Gardner, the love of his life. In 1957 was the same year Sinatra recorded his finest version of I'm a Fool to Want You, revisiting the pathos of that famously vexed relationship. I'm skipping a paragraph here. In truth, the allure of Sinatra's masculinity, what mesmerized Bill Koss and Marvin Gaye back in the day and still bewitches hip-hop admirers today, was never about sex itself so much as the sexiness of power, especially the brand of power that attaches to the outsider who becomes an insider, the demonized outcast who carves out his own imperial dominion. This is especially true of New York area East Coast rap musicians and entrepreneurs who dominated the airwaves starting in the 1990s. Jay-Z, product of a Bedford-Stuyvesant housing project, proclaiming himself the new Sinatra in his 2009 hit Empire State of Mind. Puff Daddy, the rapper, producer, and urban style entrepreneur, dubbing himself the Black Sinatra. What resonates for these black entertainer businessmen, as it has for many white ethnics, is not just the mythical story of Sinatra's rise from a humble, ethnically suspect background to the top of the heap. It's also the air of stylish menace he maintained once he got there. That aura was crucial to his crafting an image of masculine sovereignty and grandiosity, a big man front, no doubt partly a matter of ego projection, but equally a matter of ego defense against forces of emasculation and conformism visited on ethnic men perceived as dangerous to the dominant white majority. As you know, I go on in this chapter to try to cut through that image of Sinatra as a tough guy, and to make the point that the real tough guy in the Sinatra family was his mother. She was the true original gangsta. And what I'm doing in that chapter is I hope complicating the gender analysis of Sinatra and of hip hop more generally, or critiquing hip hop in the sense in which it would seize on this the obvious side of Sinatra's kind of genius, which was not just as a singer but as a guy who was visionary in thinking about getting control of his own product and becoming an entrepreneur and becoming involved in politics, but the side of Sinatra that was the feminine Sinatra, right? The side that in the 1940s was singing again mostly to women during wartime. Later becomes the Sinatra who's singing mostly to men, but mostly about male vulnerability, right? And in other words, bringing in the 1950s concepts of American masculinity forth, which are willing to recognize vulnerability and emotion in a way that cuts against the dominant kind of masculine ideal of always being kind of upright, never feeling vulnerable, never talking about your feelings. Sinatra was all about feeling, right? And what I end up in that chapter suggesting is that I think this is what we have needed from hip hop for a long time, which is a sense of vulnerability and less of this kind of fronting of a kind of grandiose masculinity. We need that kind of toughness, perhaps, in parts of our lives, but we also need to be in touch with our emotions. We need to to feel vulnerable. Men need to feel vulnerable, and they need to, even more importantly, recognize the power of women, not just their mothers, but women more generally in all of their professional lives. And I think this Sinatra, I don't think, fully accomplished that in his own lifetime, and I'd like to think that, you know, the people who model themselves after Sinatra would see that as a weakness in his life and his career, and would be very interested these days, in the same way Sinatra was in his own time, in helping African American entertainers who were getting a bad deal. That a Sinatra, you know, someone trying to, you know, connect themselves to Sinatra would be doing that for all kinds of people these days, but particularly women in spaces like Hollywood, the Academy, and elsewhere. And so that's the Sinatra in the age of Trump that I would like to see, or the Sinatra wannabe in the age of Trump. But my question for you is, does Sinatra have any resonance these days? I mean, does he feel, you know, kind of as powerful and important as he did to, you know, my parents' generation, and then eventually even to my generation? And if not, who are those people? I mean, who are the popular culture figures who today, you know, seem to have that kind of resonance, seem to have that kind of presence and power? The kind of people who are, you know, really successful as entertainers, but also have a message and make a difference in the world, politically and otherwise. So I open it up to you.
A lot of the people that have this message, I feel like, aren't mainstream, and they're kept out of the media, and they're kept out of that. Like, you know, you were talking about hip-hop artists. I don't know if anybody in this class knows Immortal Technique. That's someone who's an underground political rapper. He has been for decades now. He's someone I grew up with going to see live in New York, because I'm from New York, and he would do free concerts. He would come to college campuses, and he'd perform for free, because, you know, he wanted to get his message out, and he was trying to help the community and trying to, like, vocalize the things that he saw what was wrong with the government, and he would put it into a rap that kids could sing or whatever, or at least he could express his ideas in a way, but he wasn't ever put on the radio. Mm-hmm. You know, the things he said kept him. Immortal Technique. Is that Immortal Technique. Yeah. He's pretty powerful, if you listen to him. But, you know, and that's why he did free shows, and he would talk about them in his raps. Like, you know, people don't want to hear what I have to say, and the government isn't willing to, you know, represent what I stand for and things like that. So it's kind of like, you know, the media has a lot of control over us.
I think the media itself has kind of changed with the internet becoming so dominant and everyone having access to all music at all times. The niches that used to be predominant of underground different societies kind of clustered because the water cooler effect kind of just dissipated. So there's so many different people and so many different genres now that all can interconnect that, for example, you notice how MTV was not really an MTV anymore. Like, if anything, it's a reality show network. So, I mean, all that and all the voices that used to be heard through the mainstream networks and radios have kind of been just buried under this mountain of digital data of the internet, which is screaming a billion words a minute, and you can't really pick one out. So, I mean, when it comes to mainstream music, they pick out the one that they think is going to sell the best to the most people and say, this is our star here, regardless of what the message is, whether it's relevant or it helps society or is it anything really meaningful to say. But it's really about the money game at that point. And the real messages, the people like the real artists underground who are trying to blow themselves up on YouTube or any other sort of digital network, they're just not going to get the exposure they're going to need to really sell their message unless they really know what they're doing. Because the mainstream, because the music industry is not about messages, it's about money. As a business major, I can say that with complete utter certainty. That is the sad truth.
I think that similar to what they've said, though, that our culture is so polarized at this point on politics, and politics kind of forms such a cleavage in our society that, in a way, any of these you know, a lot of the politically knowledgeable actors, actresses, anybody really in pop culture is almost afraid to kind of touch that because it is so polarizing. I'm a political science major, so we talk about that a lot too.
Yeah.
It's, you know, there's a big divide in our country right now over politics and the economy, and so it's a lot easier to kind of sweep it under the rug for a lot of these pop culture stars than it is to really address it. So I think in you know, my generation, the people who are more powerful are the ones that draw us away from these political activities, anything that's really going on politically. It's so consuming and it's so easy to be consumed by them, and to be negative and pessimistic about maybe where you see the country going. And so for me, like, the people who have an impact are those who try to bring us out of that and keep us focused on other things. But I don't think there's one person that really encapsulates everything that Frank Sinatra did during his time period. I can't think of one person, whether it's in movies or music or TV shows, I can't think of one person that really ties it all together like Sinatra did.
I do think there are these figures like Sinatra who put up this, you know, masculine front, but they do have a feminine, vulnerable side. But then there's the question of how does the public want to interpret these individuals? Like, for example, there's an artist, Kendrick Lamar, and he has a song, Swimming Pools, which superficially seems to be about like getting drunk and being like this masculine womanizer, when it's actually about being vulnerable and I don't particularly remember the lyrics right now, but it has this undertone to it about vulnerability. So I think there's a question about how downstream these artists are in their messages and how the public wants to interpret it.
I know that Kendrick Lamar song. I think you describe it very well. It's like he knows he's self-consciously playing with the trope of the grandiose male figure, right? But then sneaking in the edge of vulnerability, and hip hop is not the entirety, of course, of our popular culture, right? So when I ask this kind of question to my students, they're reminding me that there are other genres of music out there, and that I shouldn't assume that hip hop, sort of speaks for the entirety of contemporary, popular culture.
Like just going back to Jay-Z, so I can tell how old I am as well. And the way in which he, in fact, especially of late, has shifted to more, I don't know if you would describe it vulnerable necessarily, but maybe more open and honest stuff about his mother, for instance, but even his relationship with, one of the biggest pop stars globally, Beyonce. And I bet that, not only Jay-Z's mom, but his wife, and the public and not so public trouble they may have had. We really don't know to some extent. That also plays out. So someone along those lines as well, maybe, that is not underground, because we do need the underground so much. And I think that is important, but we also need the visibility, because it's really at the, when you make it, that you can also make a difference to some extent. So that as well. One of the things that's fascinating about Sinatra is that he was never part of any underground.
He never wanted to be part of an underground, right? I mean, for him, it was always, first it was, looking at the Manhattan skyline from Hoboken and wanting, that power. He wanted to make it there. And then, and here's one of the reasons it's interesting to come out here and talk about this, because same thing out here. He starts at the top. I mean, he struggles, in the ways that I described before, but he's part of the system. He's part of the Hollywood elite from the beginning, right? And in fact, for all that we talk about the Sinatra story, straight out of Hoboken and New Jersey, coming from New Jersey, but, New York being the, sort of parable of, kind of bootstrap, up from poverty. He never lived in poverty. I mean, that's part of the, kind of mythology of it. But in point of fact, Sinatra spent most of his life out here in California. I mean, he's a figure within California history. Nobody's ever really written about Sinatra as a Californian, right? And California culture. There's been a lot of writing about Sinatra and celebrity culture. But it's not just celebrity that defines even just Hollywood, right? I mean, there's a lot else going on here. He was a big Dodger fan who, connected to the sports world in certain ways. He was connected with political figures in the state, not just Ronald Reagan, but Democrats and others. And he, even if you were just going to tell the story of the parties that he threw, I mean, that would be an interesting history in and of itself, Shall we leave it there?
If there are no other comments, I would like to hear more about everybody else, what everybody else thinks. Not only the usual suspects, but of course,
I was thinking about other genres of music that kind of have maybe an underlying political message, even if it's not very powerful. And recently, Luke Bryan, he's a country artist, he came out with a song titled "Most People Are Good." And I was just thinking about the lyrics, and it's about, I believe this world ain't half as bad as it looks. I believe most people are good. Most moms ought to qualify for sainthood. And it just has like a very uplifting kind of positive message. And so I personally turn to country music for stuff like that, because maybe it's the culture of country music versus the culture of hip hop music.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, I've always kind of viewed country as having a more optimistic, kind of laid back, drink a beer, play a song, kind of chill out, just take a deep breath on life because it's gonna be okay. I don't know. But that song for me kind of encapsulates that message that this world probably isn't as bad as it looks.
When I ask my students what kind of music do you like, they always say, "Oh, all kinds of music, except country." And that was true of me for a long time. And it's only recently I've really connected with country music. And of course, like all these genres, there's good and bad within the genre.
Yeah,
right?
Country music isn't what it used to be, 40, 30, 20 years ago. There's a lot more pop influence because pop music has shifted towards a more like hip hop, rap, EDM, into that genre, even though it's still considered pop. And so country's kind of taken over the pop lyrics. And it's a lot less, banjos and moonshine and a little bit more.
Yeah, that's right.
But to me, when it really resonates, it's because a story is being told. It's a storytelling art form, which is true of all the great world musics. And in this country, blues, what we call blues music, black music, and country music, white music, they come from the same place. They come from the South. They come from poor people telling stories of difficulty and struggle, right? And it speaks to the way in which our country has been racialized, that these two musics that share so much more than, they're so much more similar than they are different, have come to be seen as being, racially polarized. My two daughters come from Ethiopia. My wife and I adopted them in Ethiopia when they were a year old. They're now 12. One of the most fascinating experiences I've had in my life was driving around various parts of Ethiopia. The music that you would hear would be very cosmopolitan, music from all sorts of places. A lot of hip hop, a lot of European hip hop, even Italian hip hop. But most of the American music that you heard is country music. And you talk to Ethiopians, and I've talked to other Africans about this, they love country music for a couple of reasons. One is that banjo twang. The banjo is actually an African instrument. And that sound that we now affiliate with, kind of poor white Southern culture actually originates from African culture, African sonic culture. So that sounds familiar to them. But in the same way that the blues tells a story, country music tells a story, and Africans are all about that kind of storytelling.